All right. So it's 10 o'clock. Hello, everyone. My name is Abby Poelstra, and work in the Dean's area at the College of Veterinary Medicine over here in Pullman. And today we're going to be talking about Sourdough Starter 101. So everyone can hear me all right? We're good? Throw up a thumb sign or in the chat would be awesome. Perfect. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure. So like I said, today we're going to be talking about Sourdough Starter, which is the basis and the life force for any sourdough bread or sourdough baking goods. I like to call it, homemade yeast, my yeast baby, a bunch of different fun names that we'll go into today. But this is something that I started doing during the COVID-19 quarantine period or the stay home, stay healthy period, just as something I'd always been interested in, and now I was home and able to work on it. And so I will say I'm not an expert, but this is just something I've become pretty interested and passionate about in the past several months, and so wanted to share what I have learned with all of you. So first things first, you may be thinking to yourselves, what is Sourdough Starter? So this is a really lovely picture of a fully developed mature sourdough starter with whole wheat flour, which is why it has that lovely color. But essentially what sourdough starter is it is a fermentation of dough. It is a combination of water, flour, and a previous starter that allows you to curate your own supply of wild yeast. So all of your flour, if it hasn't been bleached, has its own natural yeast and bacteria to it, as well as there's yeast and bacteria in the surrounding air that's unique to each region. And you can cultivate that through a sourdough starter to lift your own breads. And what's really wonderful about sourdough starter and why it's called sourdough is because you're also cultivating lactobacilli, which is a type of bacteria that provides that great sour flavor. It's also what is the most regionally specific. So our sourdough starters that we'll develop here in Pullman and Moscow will have a different combination of lactobacilli than a sourdough starter for anyone who's over on the west side or up in the mountains. It's what provides that great flavor, and it's really regionally specific, which I find to be particularly interesting. But ultimately what sourdough starter is it's alive. It is a living organism that you are keeping alive through regular feedings and development that ultimately makes some of the most delicious bread and baked goods, in my humble opinion. Also, it was an opportunity to use this picture, which makes me laugh a lot. So you don't have sourdough starter and you want to make your own. Well, you are going to need a series of things and a little bit of a guide. So the supplies that you are going to need is water, room temperature or lukewarm. I would recommend lukewarm. It allows the yeast to get particularly active. Flour, and it has to be unbleached. You may have heard me say unbleached flour previously. So bleaching the flour actually kills off the natural yeast and bacteria that occur with the flour. If you use bleached flour for your sourdough starter, it isn't going to ferment correctly. So you can actually use whatever flour you have that isn't bleached. So whole wheat flour, a variety of different grains, and that's going to provide a different complexity of flavor in your sourdough starter, as well as a different source of bacteria and yeast. The only rule is it can't be bleached flour. Otherwise, you're just not going to see a sourdough starter that gets started. And then you're going to need a glass jar, and bigger than you think. And that is because it will explode. So we'll go into it a little bit later when I show you a feeding of my own sourdough starter. But do remember that your sourdough starter is alive. So you're going to want to provide it ample room to grow, develop. What happens is as the yeast feasts on the flour that you give it at each feeding, it produces CO2 as a byproduct. And that's what actually leavens your bread or provides that rising agent to your bread. But it also means that it can burst out of a jar. I have personally experienced it. I was taking part of my sourdough starter up to my mother-in-law, and she lives in Harrison, Idaho, a couple hours north. And I had to pull over twice to dump out parts of my sourdough starter on the side of the road as I had put it in too small of a jar. So please learn from me and use a jar larger than you think is necessary. And then here is my suggestion for starting a sourdough starter from scratch. So, like I said, the only supplies you really need is a glass jar, water, and flour. An electric scale is also incredibly useful. You'll see me use one. But to start from scratch, you're going to need to do it in a certain ratio over a period of about a week or so. And so I would highly, highly recommend that you watch Joshua Wiseman's The Ultimate Sourdough Starter Guide on YouTube. One, he's an amazing YouTuber who takes great care in his videos. They're well explained, really thought out, and really easy to understand and follow. He also talks about the science behind sourdough starters, why he uses the flour he uses, and provides some really great recipes for bread and other baked goods. But essentially, this video is going to take you through that step-by-step process of how to start your own sourdough starter from scratch. I was going to do it for you, but that involves a week-long process, and I don't know if we want to spend that much time on Zoom. Additionally, I think he just does a better job of explaining it. Ultimately, you're going to get, by following that process, a mature sourdough starter, which is what I'm going to show you today and what I have. And then a mature sourdough starter you have to feed once a week if you would like, or once every day. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So we're going to be talking about feeding my yeast baby, which is a weird name that I call my sourdough starter. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quick. And you are going to see, if I can make sure it works well, my sourdough starter. So this is my yeast baby. She's very active, as you can see. She has wonderful bubbles. That shows that the yeast inside my sourdough starter is feasting on the flour and burping as a byproduct. And so when you're first starting your sourdough starter, these are the bubbles you'll be looking for to see that it's active and developed. So this is the kind of jar that I utilize, a much larger sourdough jar than necessary. So if this bad boy got warm and got really active, there's room to grow. Part of what I really love about this jar is it has a lid that has a flip on it, which is very important. I keep that lid open while my sourdough starter is in this jar. And essentially what that allows is for the sourdough starter to burp itself. So when I said that you're going to need a large glass jars for two reasons. One, the sourdough starter itself can grow out of the jar and burst out of the lid. But two, if your sourdough starter is particularly active, it will release a lot of CO2 gas and can actually cause your jar to explode. So you want a lid that allows it to burp itself and to allow it to release the gases. So that's what's great about this lid. Today, I only have so many of these jars and they're currently in use. So today I'm going to be using what most people have around the house, which is a lovely mason jar. So this mason jar was actually given to me by Dr. Julie Carey at the College of Veterinary Medicine. Wanted to, always thank her for it because it's a beautiful jar. But what's great about a mason jar and its lid is that without the screw top, it is perfect because it will sit on top, protect anything from getting into your sourdough starter. But if gas builds up, it will lift up and allow the gas to escape and pop down. So that is how we're going to be feeding my sourdough starter today. Additionally, what I will need is a certain amount of flour. To answer Stephen's question, a slightly screwed on lid would work as long as there's some room to give. You can also use a screw top on a mason jar with a piece of cheesecloth and the gas can escape that way as well. You just want to make sure it's not screwed on tight. Otherwise, you might have some broken glass and sourdough starter, and no one wants that combination. So in addition to the lovely glass jar, we will also have 100 grams of flour, which I put into pre-weighed out mugs. partially to show off my mug collection, partially to make it easier. Additionally, I'll need 100 grams of lukewarm water. Too hot and you'll kill off the yeast and bacteria in your sourdough starter. Too cold and you won't give your sourdough starter a push. You're going, just like you would raise bread in a warm environment, sourdough starter likes a warm environment as well. And by using lukewarm water, you give it a little boost to get going. Additionally, I use a food scale just to make sure that I am weighing out the correct amount of starter. And so I'm going to angle you down so you can see the process. So first things first is I put the jar onto my scale. And you'll note that I'm doing everything in grams. That's because that's how I learned from Joshua Wiseman. My mother-in-law uses ratios, so she does a 1-to-1 to a quarter ratio. That also works. I'm just very much a detail-oriented person, so I like using the exact grams. So next we are going to weigh out 25 grams of our mature sourdough starter. So here's another peek at my starter. That was a little darker. I wish you could smell her. She smells fantastic, very sour. And so you're going to need some spoons. And you're going to see it's very stretchy, almost like dough. That's because of the gluten. It's part of the byproduct of the yeast working on the flour. And so I'm going to start just scooping it bit by bit until I get up to 25 grams. And I'm at 24, so I'll just do a tiny little bit more. What's nice about once you hit a mature starter is they give a little. So if you're 1 gram here or there on flour or on the feeder or on the starter or the water, there's a little bit of give. When you're first developing your sourdough starter, you're going to want to be as exact as possible, just simply so that way you have enough flour to feed that natural yeast and really get it started. Once it's a mature starter, like my lovely lady here, there's a little bit more give and take into it. So you're going to see it's actually very little. I'll angle you up so we get a little bit more light. It's very little starter that's needed between each feeding. This little bit of starter is active enough to keep going on, which means once you have a full mature starter, you have lots of extras, which I will talk about how you can utilize this extra starter here in a little bit. But for now, let's go back to feeding her. I'm done with the scale because I've weighed out everything else. I then like to add my flour next. So it's 100 grams of flour, that unbleached on purpose flour. Making a mess is part of the process of anything related to bread or sourdough, so embrace the mess. And then it is 100 grams of my still lukewarm water. And then you're just going to want to mix to combine. I would recommend not over mixing it, just simply because you'll start developing that gluten chains and they can be a little bit more difficult for your yeast to eat through. It is going to be a pretty thick consistency, so make sure you get all the flour off the bottom of your container. I think I have gotten all of my flour mixed in, so I'm going to give her one quick stir. Use one of my other spoons to scrape her off to make sure she gets all of that floury goodness. And then she is fed and she's good to go. So ultimately it takes me less than 5 minutes to feed her each week. So if you're worried about your sourdough starter being too much of a time commitment, don't. If you can remember you brush your teeth in the morning, that's about the same amount of time commitment almost as feeding your sourdough starter. Once you hit a mature starter, you don't have to feed it every single day unless you're going to be using it. If you are an avid baker, then I would recommend you bake multiple times a week. Then I would recommend feeding it every day and also, share the love, share some of those delicious baked goods. But I only bake once a week. So once I've had my mature sourdough starter going for a while, I put her in the fridge. Putting it in the fridge will not kill off your natural yeast or bacteria. It just slows down the rate in which the yeast is going to work. So it just keeps it going down at a slower rate. So I will feed my sourdough starter once a week. Usually I feed her on the weekends, but I used her this weekend, so I decided to feed her today as a demonstration. and she just goes into the door and does well. I would recommend not putting your sourdough starter near like the cooling agent or near the back of the fridge where it tends to be a little colder, a little icier, as you do run the risk of getting it a little too cold. But your sourdough starter, once it's fully mature, is pretty resilient. So I would, once you have it going, put it in the fridge, and that way it's less of an everyday thought. And on the weekends when you're getting baking or getting creative, you just have to remember to feed her. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to go into what you can do with the extras. So like I showed you earlier, you do have all this leftover sourdough starter that's wonderful and delicious between each feedings. And you're probably wondering, what am I going to do with it? I don't want to throw it out. I've raised it. I made sure it was delicious. I've taken care of it. And so I'm going to give you some recipes that aren't the full-time commitment of sourdough bread for you to think about using once you have your sourdough starter to use with this wonderful leftover starter. So some of these all of these recipes I've made myself, and so they come highly recommended from both me, but also my fiance and in-laws who've gotten to taste some of them during this quarantine period. So the first would be sourdough pancakes, another Joshua Wiseman recipe. His video is called The 4 Easy Ways to Use Sourdough Starter, not Sue Sourdough Starter. Sorry, didn't catch that earlier. So the sourdough pancakes is similar to a normal pancake batter, but you make it the night before and you let the sourdough starter be the natural rising agent instead of baking powder. It provides a little bit of a sour flavor to the bread, a little bit more of a complex flavor for your pancakes that are still pretty kid-friendly. It takes probably only about 5-10 minutes to whip together. You put it in your fridge the day before, let it get active, and then you use it the next morning and you have a delicious kind of twist on your standard pancakes. Then my absolute favorite, these are my go-to recipe now when I want to wow someone, are sourdough brown butter crepes. That was created by Claire Saffitz at Bon Appetit. And so the video that you can see, the wonderful recipe is on Bon Appetit's Claire Makes Sourdough Crepes Suzette. So I've never gone as far as to make the Suzette, which is a flambéed caramel sauce, but I have made the sourdough brown butter crepes, and they are so good that you can't even wait for them to cool down or to put anything in them. You just want to eat them straight. They take a little bit more time to prepare, but it's very similar to the pancakes where you make the batter the night before, let it mature on your counter for a little bit, toss it in the fridge, and then the next morning you can thin it out a little bit to a good crepe consistency, and you have a delicious, really complex flavored crepes. I made them for my in-laws the last time we got to see them, and both my father-in-law and my mother-in-law adored them, and I would highly, highly recommend them. They're so good. So good. Then I also have sourdough banana bread from, again, Joshua Wiseman. It utilizes ripe bananas, so you can make banana bread right away. You don't have to wait for any brown bananas, but it's about a little bit more of a time commitment than the previous two recipes. Essentially, you're just putting the banana bread together and then letting the sourdough go nuts. That's the most common thing when it comes to sourdough, is really letting things sit. And then lastly, I also recommend sourdough donuts, which is another Bon Appetit recipe. It's more of a time commitment of bread. It takes a couple days, it takes a day or so to develop, and it does take a little time, but it's really delicious. I mean, sourdough anything's fantastic in my opinion. I love sourdough, but a twist on some donuts are fantastic. Really quickly, Amy in the chat asked, do you know of any gluten-free flours that would work to make a starter? So I would think that most of your standard gluten-free flour, like your standard all-purpose gluten-free flour, as long as it's unbleached, should still be helpful. But I believe Joshua Wiseman has a video that talks about some gluten-free flours. The main thing is ensuring that it's unbleached, so that way it still has yeast and bacteria. But I know it takes a little bit more in depth. Unfortunately, or fortunately for me, I can eat gluten, so I've never delved into the gluten-free world, but I believe there are some really great YouTube videos that talk about what flours to use. And so you're probably thinking, Abby, those recipes are great. Love the ideas, love the crepes, sounds great. But can I just make some bread? And that's an excellent question. So the main thing that you take into consideration when making sourdough bread is your sourdough starter active enough to lift up and rise your bread? Because you're using wild yeast, it's a little bit less 100% foolproof than the yeast packets that you buy at the store. You want to make sure that your yeast in your starter is active enough, otherwise you're going to have bread that caves in or doesn't fully rise. Additionally, you want your sourdough starter to be developed enough that it provides that sour flavor, otherwise it's not going to have the same impact as sourdough bread that you buy at a bakery. So the number one way to tell if your sourdough starter is ready and set up enough to make bread is what we call the float test, which I'm going to demonstrate for you now. And we'll see if my sourdough starter, which is a couple of months old now, is ready to make some bread. So we'll pop back to another demonstration to my lovely kitchen counter. And the key things you're going to need is water and your sourdough starter. I'm using the wine glass just because it's nice and clear, but you can use a bowl. This was just so that way I can make sure that y'all can see what I'm doing. And what you're going to do is get a couple of spoons in your sourdough starter, and you're going to take just a tiny little bit of your starter. You don't want to use too much. You want to just see if it floats, not necessarily if this whole glob will float. The weight of the starter at a certain point is going to always impact it. So a little piece ensures that it's just looking at the activity of the sour starter and not just the weight of the sourdough starter, if that makes sense. Little piece. You're going to scrape it off of your spoon and have it land on the water, and you want to see if it rises. So I probably used a little bit too much or too big of a piece. You'll see that mine's semi-floating. It's not quite scraping on the bottom, it's trying to float to the top. So we're going to try a little piece, a little bit of a smaller piece, and see if it floats. You want your sourdough starter to float. That means the yeast is nice and active. It is ready to go. So here's a tiny piece. It still doesn't quite float, which means it's not as active as we want it to be for bread, which, seeing as mine lives in my freezer, lives in my fridge, and was only taken out this morning, that makes sense. You're going to want to use a piece of small, and you want it to float at the top. So I wouldn't make bread today based off of how my float test went. I would leave my sourdough starter at room temperature for a day or two, making sure to feed it. And then in a couple of days, after feeding it every single day, letting it get nice and warm and really active, I would try that float test again. When it does float at the top, it is ready for bread. And so you can start on a recipe. I would really recommend, once again, if you can't tell, I'm a huge fan of his, Joshua Wiseman's video has a really great no-knead beginner sourdough bread recipe. He also has some really great suggestions on a Dutch oven or different ways to bake your bread to ensure that you get that good artisan sourdough bread crust that we all crave that's so delicious. And so, I'm going to share my screen one more time. I would like to open it up to any questions. I know sourdough starter can be a little complicated. I hope I didn't talk too fast or skip any important steps. It is something that's been a lot of fun to play and experiment with. Ultimately, it's just flour and water. And so it's a cheap, fun experiment. If you have kids, it's a really great way to talk about microorganisms for the first time and to make some really delicious baked goods on the way. So if you have any questions, please throw them into the chat and let me know. And if any of them pop up later, here's my email. I love to talk sourdough. Okay, so I have a couple of questions. Ooh, someone dropped a wonderful recipe for some sourdough granola, which sounds amazing. I'm gonna have to try that because that sounds so good. I love the crepes and the pancakes and everything. Those are my go-tos, but now that I know granola's out there, whew, my fiance is going to get excited. Awesome. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and thank you so much for coming and listening.